I hope all of you are having a good time. I am. I promise not to take as long. The last time I spoke to this group, I had a PowerPoint presentation, and I noticed that people were suffering from the flat forehead syndrome. Yeah, all of a sudden their eyes would go like this, bam, right on the table, flatten it out, you know. But in preparation for this session, I went to one of my colleagues and I said, what do I need to know? And he said, well, all you need to know are great lies. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, what do you think the 3 greatest lies are? And I said, I have no idea. He says, well, I'll help you out. He says, number 3, your checks in the mail. I said, well, I guess that was number 1. He said, no, that's number 3. I said, well, I don't have a clue. Tell me what's number 2. He says, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And I went, whoa. Well, if that's number 2, what's number 1? We're glad to see you. Let me begin by talking about energy in a little bit of context. My namesake, Ronald Ragan, you know, I had to change the way I spelled my name. They kept sending me his check. But Ronald Ragan said that the government philosophy is if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. We seem to deal in a lot of cases with energy in that way. And it gets to be a little bit frustrating to somebody like me. As you know, I'm a retired fighter pilot. And I see a few of you are suffering from what ailment we used to have in the cockpit. You're out there yanking and banking and pull 7 to 9 G's, and the blood kind of drains from your head down to your feet, and you suffer from something called G-LOC, G-induced loss of consciousness. I see some of you got some food in your stomach, and it's starting to have the same impact here. So briefly, let me tell you very quickly, I'm not going to talk so much about the legislation that we've done in Tennessee as much as what I think needs to be done. Let me recognize a colleague of mine, Bob Martineau here, Commissioner of, also board member for Southern States Energy Board, Commissioner of the Environment and Resources there in Tennessee. And the important piece that we've got to make sure we've got firmly in our grasp here has been mentioned already today. And that, like was said earlier, is and. It's not an or proposition. It's economic development, energy-wise, and conservation. So we've got to make sure we've got both those pieces firmly in our grasp. As someone else said earlier today, philosophy. Sometimes we let philosophy get in the way of what I'm going to call practicality. In the world of legislating, as my colleagues up here I'm sure will agree with me, you operate on the premise that half a loaf's better than none. So you walk into the negotiation with your opposition and you've got what you want and what you really got to have, and they've got what they want and what they really got to have, and it doesn't match. So there's a lot of give and take, a little mental wrestling goes on, and you wind up with some of what you wanted, they wind up with some of what they wanted, and you both walk out unhappy, but I guess that's the way it works. In the long run, though, that probably gives us a better solution because something gets done. We're in a situation now where things are not getting done, and especially not getting done in one of my favorite aspects, and I want to talk to you just a little bit about that. What I call the long view. Now, you've heard a bunch of wonderful speakers up here talking about the new energy sources we've got, or not new, I guess, but more abundant natural gas than we ever thought possible, as well as, you know, more oil and getting oil and gas out of coal with gasification. By the way, I should mention there's at least 3 processes that you need to be aware of that involve coal and getting clean coal and oil out of it. And I would encourage all of you to pursue learning about those. The Fischer-Tropsch process is in use in South Africa. The Nazis developed it in World War II. It is one of the processes that's commercially viable, not the best. The Barish process was also developed by the Nazis in World War II. And if you're into conspiracy theories, there's a good one on that one because all the documentation, even the 16mm films that the Allies took when they captured the plant has disappeared. But there's the Carrick process, which was invented by an American mining engineer. And we have that in use in a very small way in Kingsport, Tennessee, and Virginia has got a plant going. But the point I'm trying to get to is coal is not dead. Admittedly, we need to be, like I said, and environmentally conscious, has to be an and in there. So finding a way to clean up coal so that it's less polluting but still provides energy for us is vitally important. So we need to be able to pursue that. The natural gas piece of the puzzle, as was mentioned very, very clearly earlier, we've got to be aware that at some point it will become a commodity. And then the price will be dictated to some degree by what goes on in the rest of the world, not just what goes on in our country. And as was mentioned, we need an all of the above. We need to have the ability when one of our energy sources, our raw materials, goes up in price, that we can put the load somewhere else. Which brings me to something that I gave that PowerPoint on a few years ago, if you remember. And if you don't, I'll tell you. It was small modular reactors. We in Oak Ridge, which is my district, are in a process of getting one of those started, hopefully as soon as this shutdown's over. And that is going to be one of the power sources of the future. Why it's important is not just because we can use it in the U.S. You know, we've got the multi-megawatt plants, the great big ones that are hugely expensive to build and get licensed for 60 years and get another renewal for 60 after that. But the small modular plants are a little different. Conceptually, think of taking the guts out of a nuclear submarine or a nuclear carrier and using it to produce power for a city. And oh, by the way, you can stack them like batteries. As you need more, you can add more. The importance of that is not just to the U.S. I mean, it's terrorist resistance, it's natural disaster resistant, etc. All the things some of the big plants may have concerns with don't necessarily hurt those. But perhaps more importantly, from an economic development standpoint, as an analogy, the underdeveloped world, the third world, whatever you want to call it, in a lot of places skipped hardline telephone lines. They went from nothing to cell phones. The technology enabled them to leap over that step. Well, small modular reactors have the same potential in underdeveloped parts of the world. You can put a small modular reactor. You don't have to have a big grid. If your grid gets it from where you put the reactor to the local place it's going to be used, it's big enough, as opposed to a nationwide grid like we have, which, by the way, is another problem that this institution needs to address and has been for some time. Our grid vulnerabilities, both to natural disaster, like sun events and earthquakes and so forth, as well as to the man-made variety. But for third world applications, that small modular reactor has a lot of promise. Why is that important to us? We want to make the bits and pieces that make it work, because it's made in a factory. The big ones are built on site. The small ones are made in a factory, so they can provide jobs for our constituents, and we can sell them overseas. And of course, we have to sell the expertise and the repairs and so forth that go with it. So it has a lot of potential there. I should have mentioned in my introduction that my district is the energy center of my state. We pump more natural gas than any other county. We've got oil wells and coal mines and wind research, solar research, as well as the premier nuclear research place there. And right down the road in the county next door, we've got the ethanol plant for the DuPont Cooperation switchgrass to ethanol. If you don't know what switchgrass is, think weed. And be able to take a weed instead of a food source like corn and make ethanol has a lot of advantages. And right down the road the other way in the next county is the carbon fiber plant that is about producing carbon fiber for use in the automobile industry. Now, all of you are aware, I hope, that carbon fiber is used a lot in the airline industry, aerospace uses. It's very lightweight, stronger than steel. Unfortunately, price per pound now makes it about the same as silk. So it's if you're not building really expensive airplanes, it's difficult. This research to industrial use plant is about making it cheap enough to be used in cars. Why is that important to energy? Well, for the engineers in the room, this is no big secret. You only got two things that cost you energy to move a car. That's friction on the ground and friction through the air. And overcoming that friction is a function on the ground of weight. The lighter you can make your car, the less fuel it uses to go from point A to point B. So a car that had a fiberglass chassis instead of a steel chassis would use less energy. That's why it's important in the energy piece of the puzzle. What do we need to do? Well, we need to be able to get that technology out legislatively by creating not just incentives, someone mentioned the tax incentives and so forth, for making that those companies want to operate in our states, but we also need to be looking at some of the rules and regulations we have for automobiles. Believe it or not, they're out there and they need to be taken care of. As you heard earlier, transitioning, still automobiles, but trucks now, a lot of the big trucking companies like FedEx and UPS and some others are converting some of their fleet to natural gas. Good news, as you heard earlier, I won't repeat what was said about oil changes and expense and so forth, but what does that do for legislation? States put infrastructure in. What kind of infrastructure do you need to be able to get those trucks running on natural gas from one end of an interstate to the other? You need natural gas pipelines. Now, we've got over 630 some already, but do we have them in the right places? In many instances, no. So the legislatures are going to have to step up and come up with some packages that are going to encourage private industry to put those infrastructure pieces in place. Maybe even we might have to pay for a few, God forbid. But all of that goes back to something that I'm going to put out here as my closing point. And that is, I've talked to a number of you, and I know that you're in states that are like Tennessee. Tennessee is one of 11 states that does not have a published energy policy. And quite frankly, we're losing out to Rocky and his group there because they do. Industries are going to the states that have published policies because they see stability. Those policies indicate that they can have a predictable business climate. I, as was indicated earlier, have been working with an energy task force to try to come up with something for the state of Tennessee. And having talked to some of you at the networking session last evening, I know that some of you are lacking those policies as well. Let me pat the Southern States Energy Board staff on the back here. Ken Namath and his staff have graciously helped me in that task. They sent me 16 copies of energy plans across the nation, which was really thrilling reading. It's an instant cure for insomnia. But anyway, the good news, that was the bad news. The good news is there was some really good ideas in them. And by being able to take what somebody's already invented, as you will, not reinvent the wheel, put the various bits and pieces together that fit for Tennessee, I think we're going to be able to come up with a very viable energy policy for our state. And I would encourage those of you in this room whose states don't have a published policy to go ahead and do that. And I said that was my last point, but there's one other one, not related to our particular situation as state legislators, but the shutdown at the federal level that's going on now is, of course, having economic ripples throughout the nation, but in the energy industry in particular. As you heard me say, we've got the premier, I think, in the world, not the world, the nation, nuclear site in my district, Oak Ridge National Labs and the Y-12 Nuclear Security Complex. And that complex there is furloughing people beginning this Thursday. Now, I personally have problems with that because that's a national security issue to me, and that ought to be exempt, but I didn't get to make that decision. The point is that it's going to have ripple because if they close things down, it's going to cost them more both in time and money to open it back up. What can we do as state legislators and state individuals in the energy industry? Well, be sensitive to that if you can, and when they finally get back in there and get it going, give them a little help. And I didn't say a thing about it, unlike my worthy colleague here, about what we were doing in the legislature. You'll have to read that. So thank you.